She didn't cry at her own wedding, not when her father placed her hand inside the cold, indifferent grip of a man she had never met, not when the priest read the vows in a hushed, almost apologetic voice, as though even God felt uncomfortable presiding over what was happening inside that chapel. Not when she looked into the eyes of her new husband, dark, unreadable, and filled with something she couldn't name but could feel in the very marrow of her bones, something that was not love, not desire, not even basic human warmth, something colder, something deliberate. She did not cry because Elena Marchetti had taught herself long ago that tears were currency, and she refused to spend a single drop of them on a man who had bought her like real estate. She simply stood there, straight-backed and silent, in a white dress she had not chosen, in a church she had never visited, and she let the ceremony happen to her the way a storm happens to a house. She braced, she endured, and she promised herself that whatever came next, she would survive it. What she did not know, what no one in that chapel thought to tell her, was that the man standing beside her had not chosen her out of desire or convenience or even necessity. He had chosen her as punishment, and she was about to walk directly into the most dangerous, most complicated, most devastating chapter of her life, completely blind to the truth that had been written long before she was ever born. To understand what happened to Elena Marchetti, you have to go back. You have to go back to a world she barely remembers, a world of silk and candlelight, of men in expensive suits whispering at dinner tables, of her mother humming in the kitchen, while her father kissed her on the forehead and called her his little queen. You have to go back to when the Marchetti name still meant something. Once the Marchettis were one of the most respected families in the city, not powerful in the way that makes front-page headlines, powerful in the way that operates behind closed doors, in boardrooms and back rooms, and dimly lit restaurants where handshakes mean more than contracts. Marco Marchetti, Elena's father, had been a lieutenant in one of the most feared criminal organizations in southern Italy. Not the boss, never the boss, but the kind of man that bosses rely on completely. The kind of man who is trusted with secrets. The kind of man who knows where every body is buried because he helped bury half of them. For 17 years, Marco served the Russo family with absolute loyalty. Or at least, that was the story he told himself. The truth that would eventually destroy two families and rewrite the fate of his own daughter, was far uglier. Marco Marchetti had stolen from them. Not money, not directly, something far worse. He had stolen information, names, routes, contacts, the entire underground architecture of the Russo Empire, and he had sold it quietly and carefully to a rival faction looking to dismantle everything the Russos had built over 3 generations. He had done it, he told himself, for his family, for Elena and her mother, for a clean exit, a way out of the life that didn't end in a shallow grave. But betrayal has a way of finding its way back to the surface, and when it did, the consequences were catastrophic. 14 men died because of what Marco Marchetti revealed. 14 men whose families were left without fathers, without brothers, without sons. One of them was a senior captain in the Russo family, a man named Aldo Russo, a man who had gone to school with Marco, who had called him brother, who had stood as godfather at Marco's own daughter's christening. The man who died was also the father of Dante Russo. Dante was 22 years old when they told him his father was dead. He was sitting in a university library in Milan, studying economics, living a double life that very few people knew about, a life in which he was supposed to be the legitimate future of the family, the clean face that would one day represent their interests in the legal world. He had been sheltered from most of the darkness, not out of weakness, but out of strategy. His father had wanted one son who could stand in the light. But when the phone call came and they told him what had happened, told him that his father had been ambushed because someone inside their circle had been feeding information to their enemies, something inside Dante Russo went very, very quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes with grief, not the shaking, heaving quiet of a man who is about to cry, the kind of quiet that sounds like a door closing and locking from the inside. He left Milan the next morning and never went back. Within 3 years, Dante Russo had become the most feared man in the organization, not because he was violent for the sake of it, though he could be when it was necessary, but because he was patient, methodical. He had inherited his father's sharp intelligence and combined it with something his father never had, a complete and total absence of sentiment. He did not let emotion cloud his decisions. He did not let loyalty blind him to reality. He saw the world as a chessboard, and he had spent years learning every possible move. It took him 5 years to identify Marco Marchetti as the informant who had destroyed his father. 5 years of quiet, careful, devastating investigation. 5 years of building the kind of certainty that couldn't be denied. And when he finally had the proof, the bank records, the testimonies, the chain of evidence that connected Marco Marchetti to every betrayal, Dante did not do what most men in his position would have done. He did not have Marco killed. He did not reach out with violence and fury and the raw, hot justice of a grieving son. He smiled, slowly, and he began to plan something far more elegant. He was going to take everything from Marco Marchetti, piece by piece, his reputation, his standing, his safety, his name. And the final piece, the piece that would close the circle, the piece that would make Marco understand every single morning for the rest of his life exactly what he had done and what it had cost him, was his daughter, Elena Marchetti. 25 years old, a nurse working in a clinic in the city, a woman who had grown up largely unaware of her father's true nature, who had carved out a quiet, decent life for herself, who had never asked to be part of any of this. Dante Russo did not choose Elena out of cruelty toward her specifically. He chose her because she was the thing Marco loved most, because taking her, marrying her, placing her inside his household under his name and his rules and his power, that was the message that would echo for decades. He made his intentions clear to Marco through intermediaries, as was the custom. The meeting was brief and brutal. Marco sat across from Dante in a private room above a restaurant and listened as Dante explained, in a voice so calm it was almost polite, exactly what was on offer. Marriage, a formal union between the Russo name and the disgraced Marchetti name. His daughter's hand in exchange for Marco's continued existence, because the alternative, Dante explained, was a debt paid in blood. Marco Marchetti, who had once been brave enough to betray an empire, sat in that chair and said nothing, because he had no cards left to play, because he had spent every one of them years ago, in the dark, for money that had long since disappeared. He went home that evening and told his daughter that she was going to get married. Elena had stood in the kitchen doorway, still in her nurse's scrubs, still smelling of antiseptic and long hours, and she had looked at her father's face, really looked at it in a way she rarely did anymore, and she had understood immediately that this was not a suggestion, that this was not something she could argue her way out of, that whatever had led to this moment had been building for a very long time, in places she had never been allowed to see. She asked one question. She asked, "Does he know anything about me?" And her father, unable to meet her eyes, said quietly, "He knows your name." She nodded. She went to her room, and she did not cry. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a cold Saturday in November. The city looked like a painting, gray and silver and faintly beautiful in the way that only cities can be when the light is low and the air is sharp with coming winter. The Russo mansion sat at the top of a long private road flanked by iron gates and old stone walls, and it was into this house that Elena was brought after the ceremony. Her belongings had been moved in advance. 3 suitcases, a box of books, the small framed photo of her mother that she kept on every bedside table in every place she had ever lived. A small life, quietly assembled. The staff of the mansion watched her arrive with expressions she couldn't quite read. Not unkind, but watchful, careful in the way people become careful around volatile things. Dante did not greet her at the door. She was in his study. She could see the light under the door from the hallway, and he did not emerge for 3 hours. When he finally did, he walked into the sitting room where Elena had been left with a cup of tea she hadn't touched, and he looked at her for a long, still moment. She looked back. He was taller than she had expected, broader, with a quality of stillness about him that was almost unsettling, the kind of man who takes space without needing to move, whose presence fills a room before he even speaks. Dark hair, darker eyes, a jaw like it had been carved from the same stone as the walls of this house. He was, in the purely objective way that Elena's clinical mind processed such things, an extraordinarily handsome and utterly unreachable. "You'll have your own room," he said, "your own wing if you prefer. I won't require anything from you that you're unwilling to give." She said, "What will you require?" He considered this. Your presence, your compliance, the appearance of a functioning marriage. For whose benefit? Something moved across his face, something brief and dark. Mine. She looked at him for a moment longer, then she said, "Then I want to keep working at the clinic." He seemed mildly surprised by this, as though he had expected demands of a different kind, money perhaps, or luxury, or freedom, not the desire to go to work in a community health clinic 3 mornings a week. "Fine," he said. He left the room. She picked up her tea, which was cold by now, and she drank it anyway, because she had learned a long time ago that some things just have to be swallowed, regardless of temperature. The first weeks inside the Russo mansion were strange in a way that was almost mundane. Elena had braced for overt hostility, for cruelty, humiliation, the daily reminder of her position. Instead, what she got was something more confusing and in some ways harder to navigate. Indifference. Dante was never home for dinner. She rarely saw him except in passing, a brief crossing of paths in the corridor, a formal exchange at the rare occasion when they appeared together at some social event his empire required. He spoke to her in complete sentences, always polite, never warm. He did not yell at her. He did not belittle her. He simply treated her as a very minor presence in a very large house, the way you might treat a painting you had hung on the wall and then stopped noticing. It should have been a relief. It was in many ways, but there was something about being so thoroughly unseen by the man whose name she now carried that settled inside her chest like a stone. She threw herself into her work at the clinic instead. 3 mornings became 4. 4 became 5. The clinic served one of the roughest neighborhoods in the city, a tangle of narrow streets and old apartment buildings where people fell through the cracks of every system designed to catch them. Elena had been working there for 2 years before the marriage, and she returned to it. Some people returned to prayer, because it was real, because it required everything she had, because in that place she was not a Russo wife or a Marchetti daughter. She was just someone who knew how to help. The staff at the clinic, Dr. Ferrara, the old physician who ran the place with equal parts brilliance and stubbornness, and Sophia, the nurse who had become Elena's closest friend, had watched Elena's news of her marriage with wide eyes and careful mouths. Sophia, who never had careful mouths about anything, had grabbed Elena's arm the first morning she came back and said, "Tell me everything, right now." Elena smiled, a real smile, the kind she didn't allow herself in the mansion, and she had looked at her father's face, really looked at it in a way she rarely did anymore, and she had understood immediately that this was not a suggestion, that this was not something she could argue her way out of, that whatever had led to this moment had been building for a very long time, in places she had never been allowed to see. She asked one question. She asked, Does he know anything about me?" And her father, unable to meet her eyes, said quietly, "He knows your name." She nodded. She went to her room, and she did not cry. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a cold Saturday in November. The city looked like a painting, gray and silver and faintly beautiful in the way that only cities can be when the light is low and the air is sharp with coming winter. The Russo mansion sat at the top of a long private road flanked by iron gates and old stone walls, and it was into this house that Elena was brought after the ceremony. Her belongings had been moved in advance: 3 suitcases, a box of books, the small framed photo of her mother that she kept on every bedside table in every place she had ever lived. A small life, quietly assembled. The staff of the mansion watched her arrive with expressions she couldn't quite read. Not unkind, but watchful, careful in the way people become careful around volatile things. Dante did not greet her at the door. She was in his study. She could see the light under the door from the hallway, and he did not emerge for 3 hours. When he finally did, he walked into the sitting room where Elena had been left with a cup of tea she hadn't touched, and he looked at her for a long, still moment. She looked back. He was taller than she had expected, broader, with a quality of stillness about him that was almost unsettling, the kind of man who takes space without needing to move, whose presence fills a room before he even speaks. Dark hair, darker eyes, a jaw like it had been carved from the same stone as the walls of this house. He was, in the purely objective way that Elena's clinical mind. She went upstairs. She lay on her bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about the man named Luca who had gripped the bed frame instead of making a sound, and about her husband who had held her wrist for 3 seconds and asked if she was all right. And she thought that these 2 men, for reasons she could not yet explain, had left the same strange residue in her chest. She fell asleep without understanding why. The truth came to her in pieces, the way the worst truths always do. The first piece arrived in the form of Lorenzo Greco, Dante's closest associate, the man who ran his schedule and his security, and, Elena had come to understand, a significant portion of his conscience. Lorenzo had always been quietly kind to her, not warm, but respectful in a way that felt genuine. He was the only person in the household who had ever looked at her with something approaching apology in his eyes. It was Lorenzo who came to the clinic 2 weeks after the shooting. He appeared without announcement on a Wednesday morning, standing in the clinic doorway in his dark coat, and he asked to speak to her privately. She took him to the small office at the back, and she watched him compose himself, the way men compose themselves before delivering difficult information. "I want to tell you something," he said, "not because I was asked to, because I think you deserve to know at least part of the truth." She said nothing. She waited. "The man you treated 2 weeks ago," Lorenzo said carefully, "the one who called himself Luca." The room got very still. "He wasn't a stranger to you, Elena." Lorenzo met her eyes. "That was Dante." The silence stretched long enough to have weight. "What?" she said. The word came out smaller than she intended. "He'd gone out alone. He does that sometimes, leaves the security detail, goes out in plain clothes. He says the bodyguards make him forget how to think like an ordinary person." Lorenzo's voice carried a trace of old, exasperated affection. "There was an ambush, a rival faction. He managed to get away, but he was shot. He found himself near your clinic. He knew it was yours. He knew you worked there. He chose to go there instead of calling for help." Elena sat very still. Something was happening inside her chest, a slow-motion collapse of something structural, a dismantling. "He knew it was me," she said. "He knew, and you didn't recognize him because of the clothes, the dark, the circumstances. He let you think. He let you treat him without telling you." "Why?" she asked. The word came out sharp. Lorenzo was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said slowly, because for the first time in a very long time, he needed to be helped by someone who didn't know who he was, by someone who wasn't helping him out of fear, or obligation, or strategy. He paused. "He told me afterward that the way you worked, the way you just moved, just helped without hesitation, he said he'd never seen anything quite like it." Elena stood up. She walked to the small window and looked out at the gray street and the narrow slice of winter sky above it, and she breathed carefully because she needed to breathe carefully. "How badly was he shot?" she asked. "You should know better than I do," Lorenzo said quietly. "You're the one who saved his life." She pressed her hand flat against the window glass. It was cold. The cold was grounding. She needed something grounding right now because the entire architecture of everything she thought she understood was shifting in ways she wasn't ready for. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because," Lorenzo said, and his voice was very gentle now, "because for 11 years I've worked for Dante Russo. I know every calculation he's ever made. I know why he brought you here. I know the reason behind the marriage, the debt your father owes, all of it." He paused. "But I have never, not once in 11 years, seen Dante ask if someone was all right the way he asked about you that night." She turned from the window. "He told you that he asked?" "Lorenzo didn't have to tell me. I was in the hallway." Lorenzo stood. "You deserve to know the shape of things, Elena. Whatever you do with it, that's yours." He left. She sat in the empty office for a long time, her hands folded in her lap, her mind working through the topography of everything she had just been handed. Dante, the man who called himself Luca, her husband, the man who had watched her with those dark, calculating eyes while she kept him from bleeding out on a clinic floor. She thought about the photograph on the desk, the way his shoulders looked in that private moment. She thought about everything she didn't know, and she decided, with the same quiet resolve she had used to get through the wedding, through the weeks of indifference, through every difficult thing she had ever faced, she decided it was time to find out. She didn't say anything to him that night, or the next day. She watched him instead, with the specific attentiveness of someone who has been given a new set of eyes, and she saw things she had been unable to see before. She saw the way he looked at his phone when he thought no one was watching. Not the sharp, focused look of a man reviewing strategy, but something older, something wearier. She saw the way he paused in the corridor outside the room where the photo album lived some evenings, before continuing on without opening the door. She saw the way he spoke to the older members of his household staff, with a spare, unsentimental courtesy that was nonetheless clearly genuine, because they responded to it with the particular ease of people who have been treated decently for a long time. She had spent 7 weeks building a portrait of this man out of absence and silence. Now she was revising it in real time, and the revision was uncomfortable in the most inconvenient possible way, because it was beginning to make him real to her, and a real person was so much harder to keep at arm's length than a symbol. It was on a Thursday evening, 11 days after Lorenzo's visit, that she finally walked to the study door and knocked. He called for her to come in. He was at his desk, papers, a glass of whiskey, the low lamp that she had come to associate with his working hours. He looked up when she entered, and something shifted in his expression. Not much, but enough. "I want to talk," she said. He sat back in his chair. He looked at her with those dark eyes that she now understood, at least slightly better than before. "All right." She sat in the chair across from the desk. She folded her hands. She said, without preamble and without apology, "I know you were the man at the clinic." The silence that followed was different from his usual silences. It had texture to it, complexity. "Lorenzo," he said. It wasn't a question. "He thought I deserved to know." Dante looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he said, "You were right." She had not expected that. She had expected deflection or coldness or one of his careful, strategic non-answers. The directness of it landed differently. "Why didn't you tell me that night?" she asked, "when you came home?" "Because," he said slowly, as though the words were coming from somewhere he hadn't visited in a long time, "I didn't know what to say. You had just—" He stopped, started again. "You didn't hesitate. You just helped. Without knowing who I was, without knowing what I was. You just—" Another stop. "I didn't know how to stand in the hallway and be your husband after that." Something in his voice cracked the sentence in the middle, just slightly, just enough. "Tell me why you married me," she said. Her voice was steady. "Tell me the real reason." Another long silence. He looked at his desk, at the window, back at her. And then Dante Russo told his wife the truth. All of it. His father's death, Marco Marchetti's betrayal, the years of building toward this specific act of retribution, the logic of it, precise and cold, and, as he laid it out in the lamplight of his own study with her sitting across from him, increasingly difficult to defend. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, without her expression changing in any way that he could read. When he finished, the room was very quiet. 14 men, she said finally. "Yes." "Including your father?" "Yes." She breathed slowly. "My father," she stopped, swallowed. "I didn't know. I want you to understand that." "I know," he said, and something about the way he said it, without hesitation, without performance, told her that this was true, that he had always known she was innocent. "Then you used an innocent person," she said quietly, "as a weapon." He didn't look away. "Yes." The honesty of it was somehow the most shocking thing he had ever said to her. She had braced for justifications, for the cold architecture of his logic. Instead, he gave her the word plain and bare, and accepted its weight. She stood up. She moved to the window and looked out at the garden below, dark and silver in the winter night, and she thought about her mother's photograph on the bedside table, and the 3 suitcases she had arrived with, and the life she had built so carefully in the spaces she'd been given. "I have spent 30 years," she said quietly, "not knowing what my father actually was, watching him be 2 different people and never being allowed to see the seam between them." She paused. "And I built a life anyway. I made something real anyway. I decided a long time ago that I was not going to be defined by who he was." She turned and looked at Dante. "I won't be defined by this either, not by what you did, not by what he did. I am not a weapon, I am not a message, I am not the ending of someone else's story." He was very still. "I know," he said again, the second time heavier than the first. "Then tell me what I am," she said, "in this house, to you. Right now, tonight, tell me honestly what I am." He stood up. He came around the desk and stood a careful distance from her, and she watched his face work through something, some long, locked internal mechanism turning for the first time in a decade. "You are," he said, and his voice was lower now, quieter, stripped of its usual control, "the only person who has ever helped me without wanting something, the only person in years who has treated me like a person worth saving rather than a power to be navigated. And He stopped. His jaw tightened. "I don't know what to do with that. I haven't known what to do with it since the night you pressed your hands against my side and told me you would try." She looked at him for a long time. The lamp was low. The winter garden was silver below them. Somewhere in the house, a clock was ticking with the particular patience of very old things. "I'm not going to forgive you immediately," she said. "I don't believe in that kind of forgiveness. You used me. That's real, and it lives between us, and we're going to have to figure out what to do with it." "I know," he said. But I'm also not going to leave. She said it quietly, but completely. Not because I have nowhere to go, not because I'm afraid, but because I think there is something true here that's worth being honest about, and I have never been able to walk away from something that needed honesty. He looked at her, and for the first time since she had entered this house, she saw the face beneath the architecture, the face of the young man who had received a phone call in a university library and walked out into a life he had not chosen and built something formidable out of a grief he had never properly buried. "Elena," he said, just her name, no strategy in it. "Don't rush it. Don't make it a move. If something real is going to grow here, it has to grow slowly. It has to grow from the ground up." He nodded. She walked past him to the door, and then she paused, and she said, without turning, "The photograph on the desk, the album, that's your father." A very long silence. "Yes," he said. "He looked like you," she said. She left. Behind her she heard the soft sound of a chair being pulled out and a man sitting down in the dark, not to work, not to plan, simply to sit, simply to feel for the first time in a very long time the specific weight of something that might be beginning rather than ending. The weeks that followed were the strangest and most quietly remarkable of Elena's life. Something had shifted in the house. A pressure that had been building in the walls since she arrived had released, not entirely, not cleanly, but enough. She and Dante did not become instantly warm. They did not fall into the practiced tenderness of a couple who had been building toward this. What they did instead was something more difficult and more interesting. They started to actually talk. He came to the table for dinner. Not every night, his world didn't allow for every night, but enough that she began to expect it. He asked about the clinic, not politely, not as social maintenance, but with the specific curiosity of someone who had spent his entire adult life inside systems of power and control, and had never encountered someone who simply chose, every single day, to go and help. He found it genuinely incomprehensible in a way that made him lean forward in his chair and ask questions that surprised her. She told him about a young woman at the clinic who had come in 3 weeks in a row with injuries she kept attributing to accidents. She told him about the conversation she had with her, careful, patient, indirect, until the woman had finally said the real thing. She told him about the resources she had found, the calls she had made, the way she had stayed 3 hours late to make sure the woman had somewhere safe to go that night. Dante listened to this entire account in silence. Then he said very quietly, "What would you need to help more people like her?" She blinked. "What?" "The clinic. What does it need?" She looked at him. "Are you seriously asking?" "I don't ask questions I don't mean." I thought about it. I told him. 2 weeks later, the clinic received an anonymous donation large enough to fund a new safe room, a doubled nursing staff, and a partnership with a legal aid service. Dr. Ferrara had stood in the middle of the new space, looked at Elena, and said, "Your husband." "Anonymous donor," she said. Dr. Ferrara had smiled with his whole face. Of course. Elena had driven home that evening with something sitting in her chest that she was not quite ready to name, something warm and inconvenient and persistent. She had walked into the house and found Dante in the kitchen, of all places, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee and reading something on his phone, and she had stopped in the doorway and said, "Thank you." He looked up. He said nothing. But something moved across his face, something she had learned to read now, something she had once thought was absence and now understood was depth. She took the other cup of coffee from beside the machine. He had poured 2, she realized. He had known she was coming home at this time. He had made 2 cups. She sat at the kitchen counter. He remained standing. They drank their coffee in a silence that was, for the first time, comfortable. Not charged, not strategic, just 2 people, in a kitchen, at the end of a day. It was the most ordinary thing that had ever happened inside that house, and it was the beginning. But the world Dante lived in did not pause for beginnings, and the forces that had set everything in motion were not finished moving. The rival faction, the same group that had been behind the attack in December, made another move in early February. This time it wasn't a street ambush. This time it was strategic. They went after the Russo family's financial infrastructure, targeting the legitimate business network through coordinated legal and financial pressure designed to destabilize Dante's position with the other families. It was a sophisticated attack, the kind that required inside knowledge, the kind that suggested, Dante realized with a cold and sickening clarity, that there was still a leak somewhere close to him. He spent 2 weeks in a state of coiled tension that Elena could feel from across the house. He barely slept, he barely ate. Lorenzo reported to her quietly that Dante was working 20-hour days trying to identify the source, and that he was not, for the first time in Lorenzo's experience, handling the pressure well. The usual architecture of control was cracking at the edges. On a Wednesday night at 2 in the morning, she found him in the study. He was sitting not at the desk, but on the floor, his back against the desk, his knees drawn up, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him, his eyes staring at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has been turning the same locked door for hours and cannot find the key. She sat down on the floor beside him, cross-legged, her back against the desk as well. She said nothing. She simply sat there. After a moment, he said, "There's a traitor in the inner circle, again. History is a sadist. Do you know who it is? I have 3 candidates. One of them I've known for 20 years. She understood what that meant. She had treated enough patients who carried the specific injury of betrayal from someone trusted. She knew what that weight looked like in a person's body. "I'm sorry," she said. "You say that like you mean it." "I do mean it." "Elena," he stopped. "You know what I am, what I've built, what I've done. Why would you—" He stopped again. "Because being what you are doesn't make loss not hurt," she said simply. "Because finding out you've been betrayed by someone you trusted for 20 years is devastating regardless of the world you operate in. Because pain is pain." She paused. "Because you're a person." He was very still. "I know," he said again, the second time heavier than the first. "Then tell me what I am," she said, "in this house, to you, right now, tonight. Tell me honestly what I am." He stood up. He came around the desk and stood a careful distance from her, and she watched his face work through something, some long, locked internal mechanism turning for the first time in a decade. "You are," he said, and his voice was lower now, quieter, stripped of its usual control, "the only person who has ever helped me without wanting something, the only person in years who has treated me like a person worth saving rather than a power to be navigated. And He stopped. His jaw tightened. "I don't know what to do with that. I haven't known what to do with it since the night you pressed your hands against my side and told me you would try." She looked at him for a long time. The lamp was low. The winter garden was silver below them. Somewhere in the house a clock was ticking with the particular patience of very old things. "I'm not going to forgive you immediately," she said. "I don't believe in that kind of forgiveness. You used me."
The source was Marco Marchetti. He had done it again. After everything, after the deal that had theoretically ended his debt, after sacrificing his daughter to the terms of a marriage arranged entirely as his punishment, Marco Marchetti had gone back to the table and traded information for money. He had, knowingly or not, provided the specific details that had made the December ambush possible. He had, in other words, nearly gotten his daughter's husband killed. Dante sat with this information alone for 3 days. He thought about what to do with it, what justice looked like, what mercy looked like, what the right thing was inside a world where right and wrong operated on a different set of coordinates than the rest of society. He thought about Elena on the clinic floor, pressing her hands against a wound she didn't know was his. He thought about her on the floor of his study, taking his hand in the dark. He thought about her saying, "I am not a weapon. I am not a message." He made a decision. He went to her. He found her in the sitting room, reading, one of the evenings when the house was quiet. He sat down across from her and he told her everything again, a new everything, built on top of the old one, piled upon it like stones. Her face went very still when he told her about her father's role in the December attack, about what it meant. He watched her absorb it, the specific stillness of a very strong person receiving a blow they have been subconsciously bracing for years. She set down her book. She looked at the window. She breathed.
"Is he alive?" she asked. "Yes." "Is he in danger from you?" A pause. Honest, deliberate. "I won't touch him," Dante said. "He is your father. Whatever he is, whatever he's done, that does not change. I won't touch him." She looked at him then. She searched his face with those clear, direct eyes that had been searching him for months now, that had seen things in him that he hadn't known were visible. "Why not?" she asked. "Your own code, by your own rules, you'd have every justification." "Because," he said, and his voice was very quiet now, entirely unguarded. "Because you saved my life. You didn't know it was me. You didn't know what it was worth. You didn't do it for any reason except that a person needed help and you were there. And I can give you a great many things, Elena, but the only thing I can give you that actually matters is this. You will not lose your father because of a war that started before you were born." Silence. Long, full silence. "Dante," she said, his name in her mouth. She had rarely said it, he realized. She usually avoided it. Now she said it like she meant the whole word. "I know I can't undo what I did," he said. "The reason I married you, the way I used you. I can't make that not have happened. I can only—" He stopped, looked at his hands, the hands that had held her hand in the dark of the study. "I can only show you who I am trying to become, if you're willing to let that happen in front of you." The fire crackled. The room was warm and low-lit, and full of everything neither of them had said yet. Elena stood up. She crossed the room. She stood in front of him, and she looked at him, this man who had begun as a villain in her story, and had turned, slowly, relentlessly, into something far more complicated and far more real. She took his face in her hands, both hands, steady and sure, the way she held things that were fragile and precious and worth saving. "Dante," she said again, "look at me." He looked. "I am not a saint," she said quietly. "I am not going to tell you that everything you've done is fine, or that the reasons behind this marriage don't matter, or that we can just decide it's love and be done with the history. That's not who I am." "I know," he said. "But I'm also not going to pretend I don't see you," she said. "I see you. All of you, the version you show the world and the version you are at 2 in the morning on the floor of your study. I see both of them, and She paused, her thumbs tracing the line of his jaw, steady and honest as everything else about her. "I am not afraid of either of them." Something cracked open in his expression, fully, finally, irreversibly. The architecture of 12 years of deliberate distance, the fortress he had built out of his father's death and his own grief, and the long, cold discipline of a man who decided that feeling things was a vulnerability he couldn't afford. It did not crumble dramatically. It did not fall in a single moment. It simply opened, like a window, like an old door finally meeting the right key. He reached up and covered her hands with his. He held them against his face. He closed his eyes. For a long moment there was nothing in the room but the fire and their breathing, and the particular quality of silence that exists only between two people who have stopped pretending. "I didn't know," he said, so quietly it was almost internal. "When I planned this, when I built the whole thing, I didn't know what she would be like." "Would it have changed anything?" she asked. He opened his eyes, looked at her directly, the way he never looked at anything, without calculation, without distance.
without the protective filter of strategy. "Yes," he said. "God, yes." She breathed in. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, and there, in the lamp-lit warmth of his sitting room, with the winter pressing cold against every window, two people who had arrived at each other through the wreckage of other people's choices held still together and decided, without announcement, without ceremony, in the simplest and most irrevocable way, to stay. Spring came slowly to the city that year, reluctant and tentative, the way spring always comes to places that have had a hard winter, and it found them changed. Not in the dramatic movie poster sense of changed, not suddenly golden and uncomplicated, but changed in the way real things change, incrementally, in small moments, in the accumulated weight of ordinary days chosen deliberately. Elena kept working at the clinic, which was now better equipped, better funded, better staffed than it had ever been. Sophia had stopped asking for the story because she had understood, watching Elena come in every morning with a particular quality of solidity about her, that the story was still being written. Dr. Ferrara had simply patted her on the shoulder one morning and said, "You look like someone who has found your footing," and Elena thought that was exactly right. Dante was not a reformed man in the way that fairy tales construct reformation. He was still ruthless when the situation required it. He still operated in a world of shadows and power and the kind of decisions that regular people never had to make. He did not become someone else, but he became more visible, to himself, to her. He began to understand the difference between the power he had built out of grief and the person he actually was underneath it. He found her once on a Sunday morning, sitting with the old photo album on his desk open in her lap. He stood in the doorway and felt every possible emotion arrive at once: exposure, discomfort, and then unexpectedly, something that was almost relief, as if having someone see the thing you've been protecting alone for too long is in fact what you needed all along. She looked up when she heard him. She didn't close the album. She simply held it out, open to the page she had been looking at, a photograph of a man and a boy, perhaps 15 years apart in age, standing outside a building somewhere, the man with his hand on the boy's shoulder, both of them looking at the camera with the same dark eyes and the same set to the jaw. He looked proud in this one. He looked like he was very proud of you. Dante crossed the room and sat beside her. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he said very quietly, He always said the legitimate path was worth more than everything he'd built in the shadows. He wanted me to be the proof of that. You still can be, Elena said. That doesn't have a deadline. He looked at her. She looked back. And then, slowly, for the first time in perhaps a decade, with all the unpracticed awkwardness of a man relearning a muscle long dormant, Dante Russo smiled. A real smile, unguarded and unexpected, that changed his entire face into something younger and almost unrecognizably open. She felt something bloom in her chest, warm and permanent and entirely its own. There he is, she said softly, to herself as much to him. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. Elena was 3 months pregnant when she told him. She had spent a week carrying the knowledge alone, not in fear exactly, but in the particular care she gave to significant things, turning them in her hands, understanding their shape, making sure she knew what she was holding before she passed it to someone else. She told him on a Tuesday evening in the kitchen over coffee, the same kitchen where they had first sat in comfortable silence. She said it plainly, directly, in the way she said all important things, and then she watched his face. He went very still, and then something happened to him that she had never seen before, that Lorenzo, who had known him for 11 years, had told her he had not seen in over a decade. His eyes filled. He didn't cry, or almost didn't. He held it back with the habit of a man who had trained himself not to for so long, but his eyes filled, and his jaw worked, and he set down his coffee cup very carefully and looked at the counter for a long moment. Then he looked up, at her. Elena,